There's always something great about musicians that are able to cross traditional genre boundaries, serving as conduits between these imaginary walls we put up to cordon off different styles of music. There's no shortage of these musicians, but today I'm going to talk about Radiohead, both their jazz-influenced mindset and their attitude towards music making, but also delving into some of the specific musical features of their work that take influence from jazz. I've made a video about how Radiohead draw from one of their favourite classical composers, Olivier Messiaen, but he had the unfortunate quality of being dead before Radiohead even released their first album, so as per usual, the practicalities and mortality have stood in the way of potential musical exchange. But with Radiohead's jazz influence, ideas and inspiration have been able to flow both ways, since neither Radiohead nor all of the world's jazz musicians are dead yet. Jazz musicians have reciprocated Radiohead's passion for their genre, with names like Robert Glasper, Brad Mehldau and more contributing to a rich musical dialogue that has spanned over 2 decades. This was especially true on their 2 albums Kid A and Amnesiac, released in 2000 and 2001 respectively, but importantly recorded together in the same sessions. I'm going to structure this video around 2 main jazz musicians who have influenced Radiohead's work, though I'll extrapolate to some broader themes around Radiohead's jazz influence more generally. Then we'll take a look at how some contemporary jazz artists have responded to Radiohead's music, and why they love Radiohead so very much. Just before we get stuck in though, I want to give credit to Pete Carney, who's a jazz musician and educator who's done extensive research on how jazz has inspired Radiohead. A great deal of this video is based upon the work that he's done, and his dissertation is linked to the sources in the description if you want to read it all, which I would highly recommend. And even though I'm going to talk about just 2 jazz musicians today, Radiohead have of course been influenced by more, namely Miles Davis and Louis Armstrong, but this video would end up being hours long if I tried to tackle them all. Just before we get into it, if you are enjoying this video so far, please feel free to leave a like, leave a comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and keeps me being able to make these videos. Also, my hay fever's really kicking off today, so if my voice sounds a little nasally, then that's why. The first of the 2 musicians I'll talk about is arguably the most key jazz influence to Radiohead, Alice Coltrane. As with a lot of the jazz influence in Radiohead, hearing Coltrane's influence is most clear on Kid A. Radiohead have said in interviews that they would jam over Alice Coltrane, specifically her 1971 album Journey in Satchidananda, which she made with Pharoah Sanders. They would play along to the album, turning themselves gradually down and Alice gradually up until they were silent compared to the record. There's a number of things on this Coltrane record that clearly seep into Radiohead's work on Kid A, but firstly we'll talk about the harp. It doesn't take a genius to hear the similarities between Radiohead's use of the harp and the use of the harp on this record, such as in the title track. Or on other songs of Coltrane's, like her version of her late husband's A Love Supreme.
It is constrictive.
Or Galaxy in Satchidananda. If you haven't already realised, this is the harp on Radiohead's motion picture soundtrack, clearly a homage to Coltrane. Johnny Greenwood said in a 2001 interview with Mixing It that these are direct Alice Coltrane samples, cut up and stuck together, making up for the distinct lack of real harps in the studio. It conjures imagery of Disney films, fantasy, spirituality, something profoundly human in an album touted, fairly wrongly in my opinion, for being cold, jagged and inhuman. All the Alice Coltrane tunes I've talked about so far come from 1971, just 4 years after the premature death of her husband, the great John Coltrane. If one listens to the words that Tom York sings on Motion Picture Soundtrack, ending with I will see you in the next life, it's not hard to see a connection here. Even though it wouldn't be released until 2000, Motion Picture Soundtrack was written in the mid-1990s. But it sounded really different back then, just an acoustic guitar ballad with very basic chords of just major and minor, yet to adopt the more jazz-influenced 7th and 9th chords that could be heard on the final version of the song.
It makes me crazy, maybe.
The song cycled through multiple versions, including this heart-wrenching piano version that was released on the hacked mini-discs a few years back.
I will see you in the next life.
By tracing the evolution of this song, firstly taking the harmonic influence from jazz more generally, and then the direct Alice Coltrane references in the harp, it can be seen how jazz slowly crept its way into Radiohead's work. But it's not a jazz tune by any stretch. You can see the influence of, for example, old Radiohead favourite Jeff Buckley in the harmonium opening. When Radiohead plays the song live, they use the sound of a distorted harmonium, a sound that comes across as rather grating to a first-time listener used to the gentler sound of the studio version. But this tone is even perhaps more effective than the studio tone, creating an even greater feeling of transcendence when the harps and the choir are heard later in the song.
Help me get back to you.
Around the time of the release of the album, Radiohead would play Alice Coltrane at their concerts. Look at this example from their 2001 gig at The Gorge in Washington State. They finish up the setlist with motion picture soundtrack, and then immediately play on the sound system there Alice Coltrane's Blue Nile. Listen to how smoothly the two tracks flow together.
In the next life.
Speaking of Blue Nile, another Radiohead song that Alice Coltrane has influenced is my personal favourite Radiohead song of all, Pyramid Song. Firstly, Pyramid Song and Blue Nile. There's clear links to Egyptology here. Tom York said in a 2013 interview that he was exploring the Egyptian section of a museum in Copenhagen. In all probability, the Egyptian section of the Carlsberg Glyptotek. There's clearly a lot of money in beer. And that this was the genesis of the Egyptian influence in Pyramid Song. So Radiohead are making a song inspired by Egypt around the turn of the century, the exact same time that they're jamming along to Alice Coltrane, whose Blue Nile is clearly inspired by Egypt, both nominally and in the wider context of the album, Ptah el Daoud, referencing the ancient Egyptian deity. Looking closer at the music, there's a lot of similarities to be drawn between the two songs. The melodies of the songs are comparable, being based on the pentatonic, and really emphasising the 4th and 5th degrees of the respective scales. They're both Swan, which is by the by for Coltrane's work, but at least in this stage of Radiohead's career was far from the norm. The drum beats are fairly similar too, with a ride cymbal keeping time and syncopated snare drum hits to vary the rhythm. Finally, the rhythm of the bass is pretty similar too. Pyramid Song's fairly unique rhythm isn't exactly taken from Coltrane's work, it's not like she invented the dotted rhythm or anything, but it's a clear source of inspiration when all other connections are considered, also since the songs are played at fairly similar tempos, so the beat ends up having a very similar feel to it. In his work on Radiohead and jazz, Carney also believes that Radiohead's Phrygian education, as he puts it, came from Alice Coltrane, specifically her track Isis and Osiris, which he calls a 12-minute G Phrygian epic, and one of the songs that Radiohead have actually acknowledged jamming to. The last key bit of influence I'll talk about Alice Coltrane is about her string arranging. Firstly, and most importantly, she arranged her strings in octaves, such as here, on her version of A Love Supreme.
Word. Love is the name of God.
This kind of string orchestration in octaves is something of a hallmark of Alice Coltrane's work, and as a result has now become a hallmark of Radiohead's string arrangement, at least in their earlier days of doing it. She also makes use of kind of pentatonic string clusters, which can be found in endless Radiohead songs like Spectre, How to Disappear Completely, Dollars and Cents, and Bloom, to say just 4. Now we'll talk about one of the other jazz musicians who significantly influenced Radiohead, Charles Mingus. When you're talking about Radiohead and Mingus, the song that immediately comes to mind is the national anthem. Teaming up with a 9-piece horn section, the song, which was also released on Kid A, has a frantic, jazzy feel. Carney, in his work on Radiohead and jazz, created this really helpful graph, which outlines how the event sequence of Mingus's Wednesday night prayer meeting corresponds neatly with that of the national anthem. Let's take a closer look at this graph to understand what exactly this means. Charles Mingus was an exponent of collective improvisation, a practice drawn from earlier jazz traditions seen in New Orleans, and the worship rituals of the Black Pentecostal Church. Listen to this recording of Livery Stable Blues, played by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, all the way back when it was called Jazz with an S, from 1917. It's a lot closer to the collective spirit of Radiohead's The National Anthem than, say, the jazz of the 1940s. Mingus' work in the 1950s and 1960s, as Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting is built on this somewhat abandoned tradition, never shy of cacophonous exaltations. The tune, which sits at a roughly similar length to the national anthem, expands and contracts in the same fashion, beginning with the bass and then the keys. Mingus builds increasingly busy lines of horns, whilst Radiohead incorporates a multitude of sound effects and the on martineau, their favourite electronic instrument, something you can find more about in this video I did about their classical influence. The pieces differ the most here, with Radiohead veering off into polyphonic horns which are somewhat buried in the mix, whilst Mingus employs more traditional soloing, first the alto saxophone, then the trombone, then the piano. But the pieces then converge in style again, and this is where the greatest similarities emerge, with key structural points in the Mingus piece being replicated in the Radiohead ones. Whilst the graph goes into a lot of detail here, I'll just describe what I see to be the essential points of comparison. A baritone ostinato precedes an individual solo, disrupted by an intense tenor squeal, before exploding into a wild polyphony, ending on a long, held-out fermata. All the while, vocals are heard shouting intensely in the background. Johnny Greenwood said in 2001 that the national anthem was inspired by the blues and roots era of Charles Mingus, the very album that Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting is on, as well as the fact that Greenwood said it would be the one Mingus piece he'd played for the uninitiated. I think of all the songs that I talk about in this video, this is the one that most directly sounds like the one it's based off, probably owing to the use of more traditional jazz instruments than in Radiohead's other work. Liam Kirkman, who was one of the trombone players on the national anthem, noted that the lineup, except for the addition of one additional trumpet, is the exact same as the 8-man horn lineup in the Mingus tune. There's a few more parallels as well. Look at the bass line that anchors the national anthem, running throughout the song. This bass line, which comprises mostly descending major and minor thirds, is really the mirror of Mingus's bass line, which uses equally bluesy rising thirds. Pyramid Song 2 has early influence from Mingus, though by the final version we hear on the album, it's all but disappeared. Tom York said in an interview in 2001 that the whole song was just him being totally obsessed by a Charlie Mingus song called Freedom, and that he was simply trying to duplicate that, with the early versions of the song even including the claps from the Mingus song. However, calling the claps naff, the version of Pyramid Song that we finally got and discussed earlier had stripped away a lot of the clear Mingus influence, at least on the surface. Tom York said in 2001 that the whole of Kid A and Amnesiac was him trying to drag out the feeling from Mingus's Freedom. But in 2003, a more clear, direct reference to freedom emerged on We Suck Young Blood, a Radiohead tune that gets a mixed reception even from their most diehard fans, but I really like. If you Google the tempo of We Suck Young Blood, you get numbers like 77 or 154 BPM, but I don't know why they're counting it like this, because I hear that as counting it in double time. I hear it at the achingly slowed tempo of just 39 beats per minute, which is roughly the same speed as Freedom. And We Suck Young Blood employs the clapping that Pyramid Song didn't use, a clear homage to Tom York's seemingly favourite Mingus tune.
For your daddy.
One final thing about Mingus is that, since Radiohead has acknowledged their relative lack of virtuosity as instrumentalists, and the fact that they're ostensibly not jazz musicians nor improvisers, he's talked about how this has allowed them to adopt aspects of Mingus's work that perhaps others who have a more traditional jazz education may overlook. So clearly Radiohead like their jazz. But how has the jazz world responded to Radiohead? The classical world has responded with warmth to the group, with 2 out of the 3 main influences, Penderecki and Reich, working with the band members and making their own versions of Radiohead songs respectively. In the jazz world, whilst Radiohead's heroes have the unfortunate hiccup of all being dead, the modern jazz world has taken up Radiohead themselves. Loads of jazz musicians have tried their hand at interpreting Radiohead songs, but one really kicked it off, Brad Mehldau. The Jazz Times dismisses Radiohead's early work, saying that Pablo Honey and the Bends are way too poppy for the serious jazz musician's taste, which, as well as being demonstrably untrue and contributing to needless and harmful genre barriers, does contain an element of fact in it, that it wouldn't be until OK Computer and beyond that jazz musicians would really start to pay attention to Radiohead as a band of exceptionally high quality. Brad Mehldau, burnt out with a lifetime of jazz records, turned to other genres of music, finding musicians like Elliott Smith, Fiona Apple, and more, but above all, the works of Nick Drake and Radiohead. He explained his affinity for Nick Drake by comparing him to John Coltrane, but if Coltrane was a folk musician rather than a jazz one. On his fourth album, Art of the Trio Volume 3, Mehldau performs a version of Radiohead's exit music for a film, something which he says borders on plagiarism of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. He's gone on to record and perform versions of loads of Radiohead songs, Paranoid Android, Knives Out and Jigsaw Falling Into Place for example. But Mehldau opened the floodgates for a host of other jazz musicians. But the only other one I'll talk about here is Robert Glasper, one of the most famous names in modern jazz. His most famous version of a Radiohead work is Everything in Its Right Place, mixed with Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage, creating an overall fantastic fusion. He's also recorded versions of other Radiohead songs like Reckoner, and even less popular ones by the band, such as Packed Like Sardines in a Crushed Tin Box. When asked about his love of the band, and Everything in Its Right Place in particular, Glasper said, "I'm a changes guy. I like chord progressions, and that has beautiful chord progressions. I love repeating one note and changing things around that note. That happens a lot in that song. It lends itself to reharmonising and reclaiming. It lends itself to jazz. All I know is that it's different to a lot of things you've heard. They're one of my favourite bands ever." But of course, when they're taking from Radiohead, they're not just taking from Radiohead and their jazz influences. They're taking from the Pixies, David Bowie, Neil Young, Aphex Twin, Ortega, Messiaen, Penderecki, and many, many more. The range of Radiohead's influence is what gives them such a unique sound, and the rich harmonic world they create, their intricate rhythmic ideas and more, all make their songs like adventure playgrounds for the intrepid jazz musician. Thank you very, very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and best of all, leave a comment, because I always love hearing what you guys have to say. And consider checking some of my other videos out. Thank you very, very much for watching, and goodbye.